In previous shipwreck videos, I've covered the wrecks of the Battle of Midway. Several warships were sunk during this battle. 4 Japanese fleet carriers in the forms of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, along with 1 American carrier in USS Yorktown, with the cruiser Mikuma and the destroyer Hammond rounding things off. Of these, 3 have been located. Yorktown was the first, found by Robert Ballard in 1998, and more recently surveyed in both 2023 and 2025. Meanwhile, Kaga was the second to be located. Wreckage from the carrier was found by Nautilus in 1999, while the wreck itself was found by RV Petrel on October 18, 2019. Her wreck was also surveyed in 2023, which just leaves Akagi, the only wreck of the 3 that I haven't done a dedicated video. At first, this was because her wreck had very little to work off of. She was also found by Petrel, this time on October 20th, 2019. They got a good side-scan sonar look, but unfortunately they weren't able to do an ROV survey at the time. With Petrel soon to leave the ship hunting business altogether, it fell on Nautilus to survey Akagi in September 2023. It is this survey that will provide most of the material for today's video, alongside Petrel's sonar scans, revealing a wreck that is in surprisingly good shape. That isn't to say that Akagi is intact. Far from it. She's in far worse shape than Yorktown. On the other hand, she's actually in pretty good shape in light of the severe damage the ship suffered. Certainly better off than poor Kaga, which was basically entirely burnt out. Akagi, meanwhile, has some of her flight deck still intact, among other things. Before we move to that, however, a brief detour to her sinking, as is tradition. This came on June 4th, 1942, at the Battle of Midway. During this battle, Akagi was struck by 3 dive bombers from USS Enterprise. These aircraft, led by Richard Best, would land 1 direct hit by the amidships elevator, most likely from Best himself. The 2 near misses did damage as well. Secondary explosions and fires joined the initial massive explosion. Efforts were made to fight these fires, but the near misses seem to have caused damage to Akagi's water mains. Most of the surviving crew was taken off by 2 p.m., with a damage control team continuing to try to save the ship. However, their efforts were in vain, and the remaining crew were taken off that night. By 4:50 a.m. on June 5th, it was clear Akagi was beyond saving. Admiral Yamamoto ordered the ship scuttled. Japanese destroyers would fire torpedoes into her side, leaving Akagi to sink bow first at 5:20 a.m. on June 5th, 1942. 267 of the crew were lost, which is a lot, but also the smallest number of any Japanese carrier at Midway, which speaks more to how devastating the losses were than anything else. In any event, Akagi vanished from history at this point, until, as noted, her wreck was found by Petrel's team on October 20th, 2019, at a depth of 5,490 meters, or 18,011 feet. With that background established, let's look at the wreck they found, and that Nautilus surveyed 4 years later in September 2023. The first thing to note here from the sonar is how broken Akagi really is. Much of the flight deck burnt away, exposing the ship's battlecruiser lines. This was the easiest way, along with the overall dimensions of the ship, to confirm this was Akagi. Kaga, of course, was a battleship conversion. By extension, she was shorter and squatter. Meanwhile, Soryu, the only other carrier in this general area, was smaller and purpose-built. So when looking at this sonar, it was clear it was Akagi. Her size and lean lines are quite visible, along with this waviness, for lack of a better word, here. It's not clear how much of this is an artifact of the sonar. The other sonar image here has more shadow in it, particularly obscuring that area of the bow. On the other hand, it shows some of the flight deck bent up in stark detail. You can faintly make out ribbing here. Unfortunately, beyond that point, there's not much else the sonar can tell us. It shows the slight crater Akagi made on impact with the bottom, along with the intact portions of the deck here, and the shapes of the bow and the stern. But beyond that, there's not enough detail to say much else. Thankfully, we have the Nautilus survey to tell us more. Now, as is tradition with these videos, I'll be dividing this into sections: weaponry, superstructure, and hull. For today, we'll kick things off with the weaponry. Akagi has an interesting spread in this regard, and an almost unique one. Other aircraft carriers will have gun tubs, but Akagi has those and casement-mounted guns. Kaga is similar in this regard, though most of her gun tubs are long gone. Let's start with the casement here. This is on the port side, and it's buried deeply. For comparison, here's the similar mount on Kaga's. Hers are much further up and more visible. Akagi, unfortunately, is buried pretty deeply here. Still, certain details can be made out. You can, for example, see the barrel of the 20cm, 7.9-inch gun, as well as the rounded shape of the casement itself. It's a tad bit more visible here, but not by much, though you can very faintly make out the viewport here, something much more visible in the third and final picture of this weapon, even if it is halfway buried in the mud. This isn't something unique to Akagi, of course. These deep wrecks have plenty of time to pick up speed as they sink. The resulting impact with the bottom creates craters and often buries the ships. How bad it is varies, largely dependent on the local seafloor conditions. Akagi is actually a bit better off than, say, Hornet. Regardless, there's nothing else to note here other than the rounded shape, and the hull above it. So let's move to the second largest weapons, the 127mm or 5-inch dual mounts. Now these are much less pretty. Higher up in the ship, they were more exposed to the raging fire, and the mounts do show this. Luckily, we do have at least one good look at them prior to the sinking here. This is actually really lucky because detail photos like this are not exactly common for Japanese warships. That said, let's look at the ruined version now. First, we have this one. The twin 127mm barrels are still there, along with the elevation gear here. However, the mount has fallen apart. You can see the base to the side where the guns fell away, be it water pressure, fire, or explosions. Either way, it's left the gun barrels detached from their mount. This is, admittedly, good for seeing the underside, but it does speak to the damage to the ship as well. Damage that isn't apparent in this picture since, broken mount aside, we only see an intact gun tub. A further out look at the same gun tub doesn't give much more to work with. We can see the edge of the flight deck better here. Unfortunately, that's about it. So let's look at the third and final 127mm picture. This one is from further out and shows a different mount entirely. Noteworthy for how the guns are still in their proper position, as well as the deck above them here. Though beyond this, again, there's not really much to say, other than the surprisingly intact railing here above portholes. As such, let's round off the weaponry with the smallest of the bunch, twin 25mm guns. We'll start here with one just beneath the flight deck. These guns are clearly far smaller than the previous one, though they also look almost too small, like the barrels have almost rusted away. That might be a trick of the perspective, I suppose. On the other hand, the staircase next to them shows almost no rust whatsoever. It's actually amazingly intact, considering how rough the rest of the ship is. The same goes for the gun tubs and gun gallery in general. This is one of the better preserved areas on Akagi's wreck, something that stands out all the more for this broken area here. Another twin gun mount, but this one has lost most of its gallery. And it's easy to see why, because Akagi's hull seems to have buckled here. The flight deck has split, leaving a large gap, while behind and beneath the 25mm mount, the ship is torn and twisted. Yet, despite this, the flight deck itself still has wood. Prior to this survey, I wouldn't have believed it. Akagi burned badly. But here we are, completely intact wood on the flight deck. That's not even a given on American wrecks, which are generally better preserved. That said, this is the only intact bit of the flight deck we see. And this view is the second to last for the weaponry. We just have one more 25mm gun alone in its tub here, surrounded by rusticles and broken metal, but otherwise intact. So, without much else to cover, let's move to the hull. First, we have this side shot here. Where this is, I'm not sure. There's not a lot of identifying features. On the other hand, this is just about the only look we get inside the ship. This is why I'm including it, despite the lack of features. It does seem to be fairly low down regardless, looking at the hull beneath the openings. Meanwhile, as we move up, things get decidedly less pretty, such as this look at the flight deck and the hull beside it, rusted out and torn apart, almost certainly from the fires. That would have weakened the metal, which made it more susceptible to rust. But it is striking. The damage is severe, and in fact some of the worst shown in the survey. Looking at it close in doesn't make it much better here. It just drives home how bad the damage is, where the deck completely vanishes, torn away by fire and explosions. That being said, the worst damage is probably this right here. Again, it's not immediately apparent where it is, but the ship has been torn up with her side blown out, most likely from another secondary explosion, if I had to guess. Other areas of the deck are little better. Here, for example, it almost looks like it was folded over the side, especially this rippling in the metal here. While somewhat brutal to phrase like this, it looks like Akagi was peeled like a can. Something that continues here, looking at a gallery on the side, with what appears to be a rangefinder of some description right here, along with an empty mount for something here. Probably more fire control equipment, judging from the rangefinder. That would put this fairly high up in the ship and make this part of the flight deck area, though no wood is left this time. We can see this part from closer in here, which shows, among other things, an open door on the rangefinder, but not much else, leaving just one area high up, the overturned flight deck. Remember how we can make out the ribbing on Petrel's sonar? Yeah, that would be this area of the wreck, where the flight deck got torn away either from an explosion or water pressure, or both, and flipped on its end, exposing the internal framework. Not pretty, but also not a common sight. Still, it does round off the upper levels. So with this in mind, let's move down once again. First here, which I believe is part of the stern. This in particular might be the remains of one of the flight deck supports. You can see a similar circular object on Kaga's stern. Around it, the deck is in pretty good shape. Even hatches are visible. marking this as one of the more intact areas on the wreck, probably because it's lower down, well away from any fire. Similarly, while the flight deck is long gone, the bow is in good shape. From above, we can't see much damage here, though we can see the overall shape of the bow, including the old battlecruiser lines. Closer in, there's still not much apparent damage. Even the anchor chain is faintly visible here. At worst, there might be some buckling and the like, but for the most part, the bow is pretty intact, which has of course allowed for this view, the Imperial Chrysanthemum, still proudly resting on the bow. This is one of the more intact ones I've seen on any Japanese wreck. It's lost any cladding it might once have had, of course, and it's certainly not in great shape. At the same time, it hasn't rotted away. The ribbing is still visible, showing the shape pretty well. All Japanese warships had this, a mark of the Emperor's ownership. It's just not normally in such good shape after decades underwater. Even from further out and above, it's still plainly visible, along with here another flight deck support. The stern, meanwhile, is notable for two things. First, where the crew painted over the ship's name. This was in hiragana, but it's covered by white paint now. You can see it and the overall shape of the stern here. And from closer in here, where that white paint stands out in stark contrast to all the rusted metal. That paint has actually held up pretty well, which to me says it's fresh. Or rather, that it was fresh when the ship sank. Thus, it has held up better over the years. The other note for the stern, meanwhile, is the anchor. You can see it and the extreme stern here. And here, much closer in, where it fell away into the mud, though clearly relatively late, as it remained close to the wreck. Now, with that done, let's move to the final part of this video, Akagi's superstructure. Unlike Kaga, the island was filmed, even if it is, well, not exactly great. As you can see, this has largely collapsed, most likely fire damaged and rusted away, which would match with reports of flames licking the area. It certainly shows much more damage than equivalent areas on American ships. You can see it on the surface here, and not much is left on the bottom. It wasn't large to begin with, and much of it is gone, leaving a rusted out husk on the bottom today. Despite this, some things are recognizable, such as a stairway stubbornly clinging on here, with the area behind it collapsed down, showing, among other things, a section of portholes. Those have survived even though they fell away. Other portholes are also visible further down here. It's rough, don't get me wrong, but like the rest of the ship, still recognizable. That's more than you can say for a lot of wrecks, including Kaga, making Akagi a very interesting case, to say the least. As a final note, I'm including a link to a NOAA article that has a mosaic of the wreck's survey, including a look at the flight deck. Well worth checking out if you have time. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.